Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we're delighted to be speaking with Antionette Carroll. Antionette is the founder and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab, a nonprofit educating and deploying youth to challenge racial and health inequities impacting Black and Latinx populations. Within this role, Antionette has pioneered an award-winning form of creative problem-solving called equity-centered community design. Through this capacity, Antionette has received several recognitions and awards, including being named a TED Fellow and a South by Southwest Community Service honoree. Within her almost 10 years of volunteer leadership, Antionette was named the founding chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force of AIGA, the Professional Association of Design. She's a former AIGA National Board Director and Chair Emerita of the task force. During her tenure, she founded and launched several initiatives, including the Design Census Program with Google, Racial Justice by Design Initiative, Diversity and Inclusion Residency, and National Design for Inclusivity Summit with Microsoft. Additionally, she's the co-founder of the Design Plus Diversity Conference and Fellowship and an active member of Adobe's Design Circle. Antionette is also an international speaker and facilitator and previously spoke at Google, TED, Harvard, Stanford, Microsoft, NASA, and many more. Antionette, welcome.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. We're very happy to have this conversation today. Please tell us about yourself and how Creative Reaction Lab came about.
My name is Antionette Carroll, and my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a native of St. Louis, and that's important for me to bring up because my work with Creative Reaction Lab first started around the uprising in Ferguson and really this tension I was having around being a Black woman that was a St. Louis native, but then also not really being invited into spaces that allowed me to center that living expertise. It was more focused on my professional background. And so Creative Reaction Lab was founded really looking at how do we create a space for community members that have living expertise and living knowledge to develop their own interventions around racial division. And namely at that time, it was looking at racial division in St. Louis. Since then, we've expanded our work to focus on educating, training, and challenging Black and Latinx youth to become leaders in the health equity and racial equity movement. We've pioneered a new form of creative problem solving called equity-centered community design. And we very much are looking at how do we build a movement of a new type of leader that we call redesigners for justice, and folks that acknowledge that all of our systems have been by design, including our systems of oppression, and therefore they can be redesigned. And how do we actually redesign these systems through the lens of equity and through the lens of liberation?
Love it, love it. So let's talk about equity, especially in the context of how equality and equity differs.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's this misunderstanding. It's the same when you even talk about diversity and inclusion. There tends to be this tendency to want to use them interchangeably, opposed to actually educating ourselves on the stark differences. And when it comes to equality and equity, there tends to be this, I would say, historical and also contemporary tendency to focus on equality because it's easier, right? Like we want equality where ultimately I can give everyone the same thing, and then pat myself on the back and said, but I strove for equality. I gave everyone $1, right? But not actually taking into account that equity is about fairness. It's about when outcomes are not predictable based on someone's identity. Equity is about systems and history and honestly being very conscious that it is complex and messy and that we've never had an equitable society. And so it's easier for folks to want to go to the space of equality because it's all about giving people equal access. Well, I gave everyone a bike, right? Or I gave everyone a house. But when you take into account history, when you take into account context, when it comes to equity, it's not as simple as giving everyone a bike. It's really looking at how do we have equal outcomes, and that means grappling with systems that have put others above other individuals throughout our time, and how do we acknowledge that, whether we're looking at the racial wealth gap, or we're looking at also educational access, and how historically Black folks actually were not even allowed, it was illegal to be educated. And it's like we are not having this conversation of our history, because it requires us to acknowledge a long history of harm, and how that continues to seep into who we are now and our culture. And many of us don't want to grapple with that, because that means admitting how we may have played a role of upholding systems that have been about trauma, harm, genocide, colonization, exclusion, white supremacy, etc.
There are so many things about what you said that I love. First of all, I think understanding the difference between equality and equal outcomes. It is so true what you said, and I don't know if it because when you treat people equally, that wins you votes, or when you treat people equally, you're like perceived as fair. Whatever that is, it's definitely coming from top down, right? Like yeah, you can give everybody a bike, but not everybody needs a bike. Maybe they have priorities before that, maybe they have more urgent needs, maybe they have 10 bikes already. So it's really like without zooming into the human needs, which is also very common in any other industry or field. Like we're very good at standardizing techniques and methods and applications, from healthcare to law, because that is more easily applied in a bigger scale. But whereas when you're talking about individual needs and equity, that needs more attention for each individual, which is the fair way, but it's not necessarily the easy way. So what you said in terms of equal outcomes and equality, I think that's something that we really, really need to understand. And also what you said in terms of acknowledging events in history, we always discuss about this. Like we personally think like we're not educated on history. Like we're given information about historic facts, but we're not necessarily educated. We're not interpreting history. We're not looking into history from different perspectives. We're all being fed one weight information of like dates, events that occurred, without doing like a deeper analysis of what had happened. And I think that is causing a huge problem in many aspects of in many social issues, and which is causing all these social issues to also be repetitive. Like in every discussion, we're repeating ourselves in history. Even with the pandemic, we've, this is not the first pandemic in history, but, we failed in, creating good policies and actually responding in time, because we don't know the history. We don't understand the history of racial injustice. We're just hearing things, we're hearing facts, we're hearing dates, but we don't necessarily know history. So, and also it probably is because it's about admitting so many of the mistakes that happened, especially by the government and then other institutions. And when they're still wanting to appear equal and fair, maybe it's a harder conversation to have, which we don't see that in, I think a good example in Germany, I think they study all aspects of World War II, and they actually do acknowledge what they've done. And the young generation actually studies this, right? Like that's at least to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you brought up. Like even the example you provided in Canada right now, they really are focusing on reconciliation, particularly with Indigenous communities. And, how do they build trust and reconciliation, acknowledge the genocide that occurred within their own country. And in the United States, we won't even admit what just happened. Like we just had Indigenous Peoples Day on October 12th. And, there's still a good amount of the country that wants to recognize Christopher Columbus and not acknowledge the European quote unquote expansion was actually like genocide and destroying communities. And, you had mentioned, standardizing, you had mentioned historical facts. And in both of those situations, I always ask the question, according to whom? Like when we
True.
say standardizing and when we say normal, many times we are centering certain communities, namely white people, to be the definer of what it actually means to be standard. Like as a Black woman and as a quote unquote African American, there
Mm-hmm.
tends to be, and I just saw someone post about this the other day, that we view American as automatically a reality of white.
Hmm.
And then we just add on to that, right? Like Latinx
Mm,
American, African American, Asian American, Korean American, right?
right. Right.
Um, and
Right.
there are some folks that maybe could say, I don't know, German American. But you don't really hear that, right? Like you
No.
hear American, right?
Exactly. You don't hear
Um,
that with Irish. You don't hear that with English. You don't hear. We don't hear it. No, you don't hear it.
No, not really. And because it's again like this standardization of a central, because I don't like to say average, I don't like to say
Mm,
majority because I don't think that's true. We just
mm,
have historically centralized white people, and we haven't really talked about the fact that particularly communities of color have been historically underinvested and has been asked to conform to this idea of normal, quote unquote, that is
mm.
centering whiteness. But then also, when we talk about history, think about the history that we have not learned, not just we haven't analyzed, like the narrative that we are receiving in
True.
in our lives, and the socialization of that as it came from our family, friends, and culture, the education system, media, environment, and the built space. These a lot of these narratives have centered white people. Like if you look at the sciences, usually the scientists that we are amplifying are white, particularly white men throughout history. There
Yeah.
hasn't been a conversation of how a lot of inventions were actually stolen from people of color, or how privileges and access, economically, caste wise, race, has led to some folks being, again, centered in their narratives, in their quote unquote reality versus everyone else's. And in our work at Creative Reaction Lab, in my life, my job is to like unpack that. Like, let's build our racial consciousness. Let's think about cultural healing and collective mobilization. Let's use access to quote unquote traditional power to actually leverage it on behalf of folks that are what I again view as living experts, what I view as people that are proximate to the issue, and many times have the capability and to do the work in their community. They just usually haven't received the capacity, the funding, the
Yeah.
mechanisms to really bring it to life as well as they could.
Yeah. Again, going back to equity, right? And I think,
Mhm.
it would be naive of us to assume anytime soon, especially from the higher level, all these issues about admitting facts in history or really educating ourselves on events in history is not going to happen anytime soon. But it doesn't really have to happen through them. Like this can be something bottom up instead of top down. And this is what you guys are actually working on at Creative Reaction Lab. So
Yeah.
I want to talk about what you do in terms of your process and equity-centered community design. Can you break it down for us and maybe give some examples of the work?
Yeah, so equity centered community design is a framework looking at how do we center community members and living experts as decision makers? How do we understand the role of humility and power shifting, as well as just and the role of history and healing in every step of a creative process. And so when you look at our framework, and there it is actually presented in a circular fashion, um, the history and healing component and acknowledging, dismantling, shifting, sharing power constructs are overlapping every step of the process, because whether you are building your team or you are brainstorming around an idea, or you're developing evaluation or exit strategies, or you are bringing your idea to life as a prototype, history and healing and power always shows up and should show up if it's not, particularly the healing piece. Because I think we don't talk about the role of power dynamics and how it
Mm,
impacts a space. we also don't talk about the fact that our history generationally, as well as our history based on our own lives, are showing up in the space. And we don't really think about the fact that, especially when we're addressing inequities, there's a lot of trauma and harm there for a lot of communities, and there needs to be elements of healing embedded in that. We focus a lot, and when I say we, I'm talking societally. We focus a lot on, let's just do a task, let's build a product, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. But again, it's usually through the normalization of a certain community of, let's build a product that they claim is for everyone, but it's really for a certain community and being pushed onto everyone. But then also looking at the reality that my trauma doesn't go away just because I'm prototyping. That is something that's literally going to be there with me every step of the way. And that impacts how I'm also showing up in a space. And so when we use equity-centered community design, for us, it's not a process, it's a mindset shift. It's really thinking about, when we are building out a product or a project, who's at the table as decision makers? And for us, we push for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth to be at the table as a part of the design team, who actually, one, is getting paid for their time. Because how many times have we seen projects where the quote unquote experts are at the table, but they expect community to show up and give them insight, but don't ever pay them or give them the space to, again, be autonomous and the decision makers that dictate how things are moving. And so, excuse me, this is showing up in our community design apprenticeship program, where in 2018, they were looking at the topic of public transportation access and how it impacts quality of life for a historically underinvested Black community, to the program that we just ended that was looking at limited healthy food access and how it's impacting a particular neighborhood in the St. Louis Promise Zone. And honestly, our cohort has already made the decision, or the youth leaders have already made a decision on what the 2021 topic will be, which is looking at community trauma as it relates to gun violence. And so when you look at these topics, some folks will look at it and say, oh, healthy food access. Yeah, everyone should eat healthy. But we also need to look at, like, how do we define health? How do we define healthy food? Also, what has that meant culturally for certain communities? And we even had in our research stage an individual say, actually, I have transportation access, but there's a sense of shame going to Whole Foods using food stamps,
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of unpacking that happens in the process of people looking at, where am I as it relates to power? Where am I when it relates to my racial consciousness? What biases am I bringing to the room? What are some of my unseen areas? What power do I have? But then moving along that, really looking at, how do we center community through every step of the process, from the beginning to the end? And when we're at the end, how do we develop an exit strategy or a continuation strategy that doesn't create more trauma within the community? And it is a process, and it is ongoing. But what we've seen is that the impact on the youth that have been a part of the teams themselves, and the impact on the community, has been multiple fold.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many beautiful parts of the process. Like, it's not just design, it's communication, it's psychology, right? Like, many layers of things that are ingrained in human beings. It's natural to us anyway. And it's so true that, everybody reacts to their own trauma or struggles differently. Like, some people may still have a very positive attitude and they can be very collaborative and maybe easy to work with. And some people might be very aggressive about it because of all the unfairness, and it comes out as anger, because they're all fair human emotions. And so if we really want to have an inclusive table, right? Like, if we really want to be able to work with people with diverse backgrounds or races, then we have to acknowledge that those emotions can come to the table. And how do we deal with that and get over that? And also, like, to the point where, like you said, not creating a second trauma, but having this space as a constructive space for them.
Right.
It's very human-centered, and it's beautiful. And honestly, like, it can like we don't have to see this as a process. And we often talk about this in like inclusive design. It doesn't have to be seen as like, oh, like this process is needed for these people, right? Like it's actually just a simply better process for everyone. So, but clearly, because it's equity centered, it's the way to elevate people who were oppressed for so long. And I think that's what we really need to understand. It's the better way. It's the more sustainable way too. Like there are so many things in what you said in terms of like creating real impact in communities. And you know, there by good intentions, like there are so many organizations or projects that do these like one-offs, right? Or it almost feels like a top down, like this area needs this, we're going to bring them that, almost like the white savior syndrome thing happening. Like we see that a lot where like community is not engaged. It doesn't help that it's one off. They may become even more skeptical that, you know, nobody really cares about us, you know, this is just thrown our way, we're not necessarily in the conversation. But when you have people at the table making decisions for their community, that's so empowering. And that what anybody needs. Like you want to be heard, right? Like you want to be respected for your time, hence get paid, and you really want to be heard. Like that's the need of any human being. So it's, you know,
and not just be viewed as like a research subject, right? Like, which happens a lot. Like you had mentioned, you know, like intentions. You know, how do we hold ourselves accountable not to intentions, but actual impact? And because I will be very honest, I've seen so many folks say, but I had the best intentions. Your intention still doesn't mitigate and take away from the fact that you've harmed me. And that I have to now navigate that harm on my own, and you're just able to keep going and say, well, I had good intentions, and just take away the responsibility. Like just to even think about the unfairness of that. And then also, like when we talk about like white savior complexity, that is something that has been embedded in our culture, whether you're white or not, right?
So
like when most people think of white supremacy, they think that only white folks can be like uphold those standards. But it's like literally this is the culture that we have been seeped in. And so we have to unlearn a lot of things to actually challenge the white supremacy culture. And part of that, underneath that, is the white savior complexity. You see this in the nonprofit space. You see this in international development. You see this amongst in many different ways. And it's like, again, folks have good intentions. Ooh, I want to help. But you know what actually would help more? If individuals actually took the time to really reflect on what happened in my history, what are things that I need to address in my own backyard, and then create change there. Like there was a tweet by I can't remember his name right now, but we actually include the tweet in our how design thinking protects white supremacy webinars that we host. But in the tweet, this instructor talked about how white folks need to start viewing racism as an issue that they need to address in white folks, opposed to an issue around empathizing with Black folks. Because that's what's happening, right? Let me go and empathize with Black people instead, you know, or empathize with indigenous people.
Like you clearly know your problems, right? Like you should be the last person to talk to when it comes to like, I mean, if you really want to understand what you've been going through, maybe. But if you want to talk about racism, like that's not your problem. It's a white problem. Like that is fascinating to me how like, I also, we were doing a panel once and Kimberly Drew was on the panel and she was saying like, I'm so annoyed when like people are talking about issues that Black people face and they're looking at me when they're talking about it. I already know, you know, like you need to look at everybody else.
Right. And you know, there is a tension in, like, for instance, the equity, diversity, inclusion space where you will have Black, Indigenous, Latinx folks, like people of different Asian descent, that will say, you know, why are you looking to me of addressing this issue? I didn't invent this system of oppression. Why are you asking me to do it? And for me, I'm one of those where I'm a yes and person, because I'm like, yes, you need to do your own internal work in your community. I actually saw someone the other day saying Karens need to talk to Karens, but like, do your own internal work in your community. And my fear is that if they also only do it through the lens of whiteness, then do we continue to have the same like systems showing up, because there's no inclusion of Black voices or Latinx voices
Mm,
or Asian voices or Indigenous voices. Because again, it's like, yes, they need to do internal work, and we also need to do some internal work, because by being recipients of a lot of this generational trauma and harm, we've had to put on many different masks to navigate that throughout our own generations and lives for
right.
survival. And now you're starting to see tokenism, respectability politics, internal racism. And so
Mm,
to me, it's a yes. It's like both. We need it both to happen. And it shouldn't just be on the people of color, just like it shouldn't just be on white folks. But
yeah.
we need to do work internally, and then we need to do work also cross.
Yeah.
But again, sharing power and shifting power, and not just having it where folks are like, let me go help this community because it makes me feel great. I have no idea what this community actually needs because I'm not even a part of it. But hey,
Yeah.
I can put it on my resume and say that I did it.
I
Let them
mean,
know.
it like so much of it starts with like upbringing, right? Like I think it's very it's not common you see like people actually be really interested in a subject unless it hits home or it's really close to them,
Yep.
right?
Hmm.
Which is sad. I think we can raise human beings that are not only empathetic but also curious and understanding and just patient to put time for something. And I think to your point, like in what we see in many nonprofits too, we donate money because we want to feel good about it,
Yep.
but we really don't look into the outcomes or the work or how people were helped. Like we don't make the time. And I
Hmm.
think what we really need is putting time for each other to really understand what's going on, because frankly we didn't do it while we were being educated. Like going back to our education on history, I mean, we put time on memorizing facts about our history, but we really didn't put time in understanding human perspective, different human perspectives in history.
Right.
It's part of our education system, part of our upbringing. Like these things shouldn't be sugar coated, right? In like family conversation, we're already really big about that. Like I think so much of what's happening in the society is also very sugar coated to children, so they actually don't
Yes.
know how to talk about it. So when you're an adult, it's an uncomfortable subject. So you're kind of like, well, no, I'm not a racist, but you're also not speaking up, right? Because it's an
Hmm.
uncomfortable subject for you. So when you're not speaking up, that's actually hurting others,
Hmm.
right? And we're also setting an example for others. So I think, and I'm hoping what has happened over the past few months, like more people will be conscious about speaking up or at least having a discussion with someone that they never did before. But what we really need is that sort of marrying into our systems, marrying into our
Hmm.
processes more and more, which organizations like you are amazing examples of. Not just like, yes, we're providing this help for this community, but it's actually about we're bringing them into action. We're
Right.
giving them the tools and to empower themselves and also to take their space and claim their communities. Like they actually are the people who should be making decisions anyway. You're just
Hmm.
giving them the tools. So I
Hmm.
think that we have to sort of recognize that we need to speak up and take action, instead of what you said in terms of just I helped, which
Right.
who knows in what form that comes.
Right. And make
um
sure it's also not performative. Like
yeah.
we've seen these moments over time where it's like, oh my goodness, what has happened? Like the civil rights movement was so quote unquote successful because they were able to leverage media, particularly TV, to say, look what's been happening. We've been saying this for the longest. And we're seeing this restart as well with social media, not just with the hashtags, but with the videos and like look at what's been happening. But like, think about the continual trauma even of that. Like, say if I am a
Sure.
person that's being affected by police brutality, I am on the video, and it's like you need the video for you to feel that this is actually real, but you're not also thinking about the trauma that I have from actually like being recorded and having this act committed upon me, and in many cases in multiple times, because it's spreading through social media, and it's like it's a double-edged sword in a sense. And so,
Such a
you
good point.
know,
Yeah.
there's a show on Netflix called Dear White People, and they recently just did a video on their social media called Dear White People: The Curriculum, and they were walking through one of the episodes where one of the characters actually was like being affected by police brutality. The gun was pulled on him. People pulled out the cameras and like, look at what happened. And the director actually asked the actor, like, did that also traumatize you as a Black man, not just the character, but
Mm,
you? And he talked about how he felt it was necessary to do it, but he still suffers from PTSD from
wow.
even acting that role,
Wow.
especially when everyone pulled out the camera, because they had to show what was happening for, like, let's be honest, when we're showing the video of what's happening, it's not for Black people. In most of the cases, we're showing a video so that white folks can see, no, we're telling the truth. Look at what's happening to us. And
Yeah.
so it's like we have to show it as proof, and we are still seeing that proof is not even enough. And so it's like the continual traumatization of our communities. And we're just constantly like trying to find a way to navigate that and say, look, see us, we've been here, this has been happening for centuries. And you have some folks that are tired, and you have some folks that are tired while still doing the work, but we still sacrifice essentially our own spirits and well-being again to try to create some type of dent when it comes to equity. But then I also want to touch on two very quick pieces you brought up around being racist or not being racist. There
Mm,
needs to be this push of not just not being racist, but actually being anti-racist. Because it's like, again, when you think of not being racist, that's very individualized. But if you're
yeah.
anti-racist, you are actually actively, like, not just being an ally, which in our work we talk about being design allies, being active in changing what needs to happen, not just being
Mm,
an ally, but what are you actively doing to actually
mm,
challenge the racism that you're seeing, whether it's at an interpersonal level, an institutional level, a systemic level, right? But
mm,
then also, when we think about the importance of consciousness raising, this is at every level. And I think a good organization that folks should look into, especially if they have young children, is We Stories. And We Stories is an organization that's based in St. Louis, but my understanding, due to the pandemic, they now are nationally reaching, where they are directly working with families that have white children and having them actually consume books about Black people, not just Black people in trauma, but Black people in joy, because they found that the earlier you're able to actually expose white children to different races and identities, and not just Blackness, but also other identities as well,
mm-hmm.
they're actually more likely to be empathetic, to build their own humility, to be able to work through the system of racial inequities. And I think what they're doing is fabulous, and I definitely recommend them for folks that have children that want to dive deeper into this work, and then also look at how do I raise my own racial consciousness
Mm,
as a person, a resident in this world, not just in the United States, but across the globe, because white supremacy cross borders. It is literally global. It is not just a United States construct.
yeah. And we just need to acknowledge that it's impossible for you to empathize with everything. Like, you just can't. So you need to, like, even, you don't have to think this in terms of like race. Let's talk about like being parents, right? Like, and someone who's not a mom maybe can understand what a mom might going through, but can't really understand what she's going through. You know what I mean?
Right,
Like,
right.
it's really impossible because you're not that person, and you don't share the same experience. So we just need to acknowledge, even if you think you're not racist, I mean, maybe you're questioning if you're anti-racist, right? Just, expose yourself more, have conversations with people. Like I have, for example, many friends with disabilities, and like that's natural to me. They're around me. Like I have a 2-year-old daughter. In her books, like there's always someone who has a disability in there too, because I want that to become like, that's another reality of just humanity,
Right.
period. Like it's really like ability, disability doesn't matter. But at the same time, still I can easily discover something like once a month that I maybe wouldn't think that it might be inappropriate to say. Or maybe if I put it in a different way, they would have understood it better. I would have communicated better. Like it's a continuous education, because we were never given the tools growing up to have conversations
Exactly.
about different perspectives. So we just need to acknowledge that we can mess up. Maybe, those people who were saying like, I had the best intentions. Well, sure, you might have the best intentions, but explore that outcome. Why did you hurt that other person? Like deep dive, like do a deep dive into that. And maybe you'll be ashamed of it. I mean, it's not a proud moment, but you can grow out of that. I think we just need to acknowledge that we all need to grow, and continuous education is a thing and should be a thing. And so that we don't shy away from these topics because we feel insecure about it, or like we don't know what to say, or it makes us uncomfortable. So I loved what you said in terms of starting the conversation with children and the work of We Stories. We have interviewed before also Brownicity, and we also had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Berry. So it really starts with the youth. And I can't even, like, when you were talking about the trauma that people had, like seeing that, it makes me think, when you have movies like coming out, it would have like parental guidance recommendations, right? Like age
Right.
13, whatever. But like Black people don't have that luxury when they're like sharing shootings that is happening, because they're trying to communicate the extent
Yep.
of the problem that they're suffering. And then how is that going to impact an entire generation and how they feel? Growing up, like it's crazy, and we need to think about those more, instead of just being like, oh my god, I can't believe people are being shot at. Like it's I think we really need to put things into context and really try to do a deeper dive into every subject, and just accept the fact that we need to grow, right?
And
Like
also, like, and it's a journey, like I am very conscious that I will be unlearning for the rest of my life, and that's okay. Right.
so true. Yeah, let's just say that it's not a continuous education. It will be an ongoing unlearning process.
The entire life, and I think it's one of those where we seem to think, oh, I read a book, well, I got it. And it's like, no, like we all are unpacking every single day. Like I have continually been unpacking, like, how am I even part of the equation of creating harm, and what can I do to change that? And in Creative Reaction Lab, we actively have a culture where we talk about these things, like, oh man, we unintentionally created harm here, but then again, intention doesn't mean anything. So how do we hold ourselves accountable to the impact now, and also make shifts for the future? And so, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that requires us to build this equitable, liberatory society. But just because it's hard, and just because we may not see the outcome, like I'm convinced I probably will not see the equitable world that I am working towards. But I'm just gonna be honest, but I view my work as drops in the bucket. I view my work as cathedral building. The people that were building cathedrals knew that they would not see the final piece, but they knew what they were doing was so important to the foundation of it, and that they actively had a role to play in getting that final institution. And that's how I feel when I think about my work, as a Black woman that's a serial social entrepreneur, that's a mom of Black men, that's a wife to a Black man. Like, my work is cathedral building. And I'm hopeful that if it's not for my sons, their children will hopefully see that world that I've been collectively, because I would say a lot of us have been actively working towards.
So well said. So I feel like this entire conversation was full of amazing advice, but I do want to, allocate a special piece for that. For anyone who's doing progressive work or trying to do progressive work, because we also know it's not easy, right? It's a everyday battle. What would be your advice to them?
I would first, in a sense, we have this activity that we call all this power analysis, but analyze where you are. Like actually sit and reflect and do some journey, like some a journey mapping of where am I and what have I done and what do I need to first like reconcile myself and where are areas that I need to continually build my knowledge. Also, I recommend folks actually like listen to people of color. And that means not just, oh, something has happened, it was just in the news, I'm gonna look at this moment. No, like really think about what am I consuming every day? And have I centered certain voices, particularly people of color, in what I'm consuming? Because when you start to make that part of your reality, you start to see, oh, the world is a lot bigger. And the experiences that I've had is only a small piece of what actually is happening in this world. And then I also recommend don't automatically jump to let me create, but because many times and I know this is going to sound weird because clearly I created many things, but but hear me out when I say this. What I'm saying is it's not that you shouldn't create, but first see what already exists and see how you can build trust within that community, come in and listen, say how can I help you once you've actually started to build that trust, and then see what you're creating from then. Because there are many organizations that's doing great work. Colocate Design, Designers Protest, Hip Hop Architecture, 228 Accelerator, the Equity Lab. Like there's so many groups that are doing the work on the ground. And we have to think about, one, do I have a lot of privileges that if I enter this space, am I erasing what they're doing because I've had greater access? Or how do I actually leverage my power and access for the folks that have already been doing the work and help them actually get into these rooms that maybe I have access to? And so that's where I want people to, it's not that I'm like, don't create anything. Clearly my company name is Creative Reaction Lab. We're all about creation.
But create in a smart way, in a collaborative
create in
way.
a smart way, in a collaborative way, in a co-creative way, in a way that doesn't erase the assets that are already in a community. And even when we start programs, the first third of the program is actually them analyzing themselves, is looking what's already in the community. It's not like we jump in and say, all right, limited healthy food access, let's go, right? Like, no, what's already there and how can we maybe amplify or support opposed to actually contributing to more erasure, which has continually happened throughout society.
Yeah. And that's such an important point, I think, what you're making, because like there are so many nonprofit organizations out there that might have similar missions and yet like working all separately, not collaborating with one another.
Right.
So funds are being dispersed to all different ways. Some are managed poorly, some are managed well. But then like maybe if they were all under an umbrella or a coalition or something, maybe so much bigger things could have been created by sharing resources or simply collaboration, right? So I think that's a very, very important point. And we really need to understand this is something that is hard to resolve on your own anyway. It's maybe impossible. So you need to collaborate anyway. So you might as well, learn from existing things and maybe collaborate with them too. So that was wonderfully said. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below.